Welcome to our training on elevating your compassionate communication after a traumatic event. Thank you for joining us today. We wish to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land and waterways on which we are meeting today. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and emerging, representatives here today. We welcome everyone and thank you for sharing your time with us. I am Katrina Otto from Train IT Medical. Some of you may know me. I do spend my life traveling around Australia, training in medical practices, running presentations for medical director best practice, the primary health networks and peak bodies like AAPM. Like I think a lot of Australia, we've been feeling devastated by these recent fires and wanting to do anything we can to help. My background is as a practice manager. I've worked in practices for 30 years. I keep thinking, if I was on the front desk in a medical practice, what could I say? What could I do? How could I help? How can we elevate our care? I get asked often to provide training for medical receptionists. And I was a TAFE teacher for 23 years, teaching medical receptionists and practice managers. So I did what I recommend others do when they need to learn more. I asked my colleagues who are trauma trained, who work in this area, I reached out to them, and they, like others, let to be helpful, volunteered their time. My friend and colleague here, Monique Dickerson from Insight Group Facilitation, quickly and kindly agreed to donate her time and is joining me today. And we're both keen to share some helpful tips, some care strategies, both for your patients, for each other in the practices and your practice community. So the training we have put together today, we hope will be very helpful, help support all of you wonderful people out there working in practices. This is the first stage of our help and support for you. We have 2 pages of additional resources and links and information support at the end of this presentation. You can download this presentation. And because I started a not-for-profit business with some of my improvement colleagues last year, Dr. Tony Lemke, Kim Poyner and Rivka Hagen. This training and the next stage of this training will be brought to you for free. We hope that you will share it. We want to build support, let everyone know that we are here for you. So this training today is focused on medical receptionists. We want to be able to build confidence for when working with patients who have experienced trauma, because while we do work with patients who are in distress often, and some have experienced trauma, of course, this is unprecedented at the moment. We have not only a lot of our patients, we have vicarious trauma, we have a lot of our staff, a lot of our team, a lot of our community. So we really want to be able to help support. Monique is going to talk to the impact of trauma on the brain. We'll talk about ideas. What can we say? What can we do to help communicate our support for our patients and also for our practice communities?
Okay, so as Katrina said, I'll be talking a little bit about trauma. I just want to be really clear that this is a very simplified presentation. It's not developed to talk about complicated neuroscience. It's just if people understand how the brain responds to trauma and what's happening for a person in the moment when they experience trauma, it can be helpful in understanding what's happening for people. Before I start with the brain, I just wanted to talk about a few key ideas. The first thing is to remember that people experience trauma differently. One patient might present in a certain way and another patient might present in another way. So don't expect, it's horses for courses. One method might be appropriate for one and the other appropriate for the other. And luckily, because you're part of the community, you'll have an idea of, what's happening for each person, hopefully. And you can certainly pick up cues from people. The other thing I want to talk about is that this type of support that a person gets in these moments can actually be a really important part of their healing. We don't expect you to be, crisis counsellors. That's not your job. But what we know that small gestures of kindness can really make a big difference. It's like your little piece is part of the larger jigsaw puzzle. Don't underestimate the little bits and bobs of kindness, how you can put that in there, and that can actually impact in a very positive way for people that are experiencing trauma at the moment. So, to the brain, very basic lesson, just reiterating that this is, just to give you some idea of, what's been happening, what potentially is happening for people at the moment. Really, really quick presentation. So, a little bit about the brain. So what we have here, and I'm going to use Dan Siegel's wonderful hand model of the brain because it's a great way to understand the process. So if we have a look at our hand model, I hope you can all see my hand. I'm looking at, this is a representation of the brain, and what we have here, the part we're talking about here to here, is called the brain stem, and the brain stem's job really is about passing information from the head down to the body and back through the nervous system. It also looks at the sort of functions that are going along in the background, the survival functions that keep us alive as human beings, things like breathing, swallowing, all those sorts of things, sleeping, all that sorts of things sort of happens really in the, it's kicked off around the brainstem. Very, very simplified just idea of that. So keep that in mind, brainstem. The next part of the brain that we'll be talking about is the cerebellum. So if we're looking at our hand model, we've got the brainstem. Then down here, and I'm looking at my head, sort of this part of the brain, the bottom part of the brain is the cerebellum, which is the motor center of the brain. So it's looking at the higher motor orientated functions. So, you can see this develop in a human being over time. For example, it kicks off when babies start, just even sticking their tongue out, and then they go to crawling, walking, etc., right up to doing complex motor orientated tasks as you grow older into an adult, things like driving a car, working machinery, etc. So motor center of the brain. The next part of the brain that I want to introduce to you, and this is something that I'm going to be focusing on a lot, is the limbic area. So if we're looking at my hand model of the brain, and I'm looking at my own brain, it's sort of sitting deep, sort of in the middle of the brain, deep down in the middle of the brain, called the subcortex, deep down in the middle of the brain. And the limbic area is really the emotional center of the brain. It looks after, it sort of, works with a few functions, things like how we store memory, how we evaluate situations, how we can motivate ourselves, how we connect with other people in the world. But mainly, one of the main functions is where our emotions are centered. So our emotions pretty much mostly center in the limbic area. So we're talking about that part of the brain there, sitting deep in the brain. The next thing, I need to say, so it's very important that you know that all these lower brain functions really look after our survival system. So they're all sitting in this lower part of the brain, and we're particularly looking at the response, and some of you might have heard in other training that stress response they often talk about. I call it threat response sometimes, is fight, flight and freeze, right? And they can have a particular impact on how you behave, on behaviour. The main thing I want you to think about is that this lower part of the brain from here down, very much driven by instincts, instinctual reactions, and very reactive. So what you need to be mindful of is that there's no thinking or rationalization in this part of the brain. It's really about instincts, reaction. Now, we're starting to talk about what we call the higher brain, the high executive functions of the brain. We're talking about the part of our head that sort of goes over here. This is the cortex, and we're particularly going to look at the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of our brain here. Now, this part of the brain is sort of the thing that separates us from, other mammals, and we call it the higher functions, the executive part of, the executive brain, and it looks after really important activities such as focus, concentration. It helps us to make decisions. It helps us to problem solve. It makes us reasonable. It helps us to evaluate a situation. It gives us the opportunity to reflect on our own experiences and how that impacts on self and others. It helps us to plan. It helps us to organise. So keep those higher functions. So if you like, we're talking about what we're looking at here is the survival centre down the bottom, and the top of the brain is looking at the higher executive, part of the brain. And what we do know is the higher part of the brain can calm the survival system down. Where trauma plays into this is that when somebody's experienced trauma, what we know is that the bottom part of the brain, the survival centre, is going to take over the top of the, just take over the brain. And, from another evolutionary perspective, really, it takes over in order to keep us alive and to keep us safe, because we need to be reactive, instinctual when we're under threat. So what happens when we're feeling threatened is that the top of the brain, the rational, the thoughtful part of the brain sort of goes offline. And Dan Siegel would call it, we flip out. And I'm sure you've experienced when you've been feeling just general stress, sometimes you can't think properly. And that's because this part of the brain's sparking and it's running the show, and there's no rational thought in that. So what's happening potentially for your patients at the moment is that they've been overwhelmed by a dangerous situation. The survival system's always going to push up and it's going to take over, and it takes quite a while when someone's experienced a really stressful and frightening situation for that part of the brain to settle back down again, and things can set that off. They can be very reactive, very emotional. So what we're looking at is just some ideas about, just basic ideas about the neurological impact of trauma, is that we know that people's feelings and perception get shifted around. Now, over time this can settle again, but so what will happen is they're really overwhelmed by their feelings. Their feelings are, taking over, and they don't have a sense of being able to control their feelings, and it can happen in the moment. But also their perception of the world, they start to feel frightened. The world's not a safe place. There's a sense of negativity, potentially, depending on the person, but it can have a negative impact on how they see the world and how safe they feel in the world. We know because this has gone offline that they can struggle to store and retrieve information. And from what my discussions with Katrina is, we know that can be really challenging if you're trying to help a patient remember instructions, really important instructions, particularly important ones. It's very hard sometimes when people are running on the, sparking on that limbic area for them to take that information in, because it's just not settling into the memory because the survival system's running the show. It can impact on their problem solving, and we see sometimes with clients we're working with that they really struggle to make appointments on time. They might have been meant to bring maybe ask them to bring a say an X-ray or something, they'll forget about it. So being able to do those higher the stuff that we need to have our brain working, it sort of might be on a holiday at the moment while they're struggling with their reaction to these terrible events recently. And just please be mindful that the emotional centre can be sort of running the show. And as I said before, that means people can be very reactive, and sometimes that can come out at you. And my big message here is, just don't take it personally. It's not that people are actually meaning to be offensive or hurtful or reacting to you. It's not really about you. It's about the fact that they're struggling to, keep their emotions under wraps. And, sometimes the innocent bystanders in the community can be, on the receiving end of that. And certainly, medical reception staff.
And that's something that we do get now at times. We do see patients not irregularly who are in distress and sick and reactive. And I think the really important thing is at the moment, this is unprecedented in the number of people that we are seeing and we will see. So being aware of that is really helpful, really important to help us manage our own reactions in the practice. And we're going to give you some tips and tricks to help with that. But first of all, it's really helpful to understand how we can
potentially de-escalate.
That's a great word.
And so the research shows that empathy, and it consistently shows that if listeners for people that are on the receiving end of trauma affected people can really help by showing empathy. And we're going to show you in a minute, Katrina's going to show you in a minute a really fabulous video that just gives you an idea of what this might look like. But you were talking to me about, the relationship that medical people have.
Yeah, in medical practices, you really know your patients and are the people best placed to help them and know what is appropriate help. I just cannot stress enough how important your job is on the front desk. I really wanted to focus this training today for medical receptionists and practice managers. There is a lot of training and a lot of help for nurses and doctors, and of course they're on the front line of care. I had a GP say 80% of her patients are crying at the moment. So I understand that, and one of the things I'm well aware of is 100% of patients go to the front desk. So you are so important. What might seem to you like a little act of kindness can make a really big difference. So let's play this video on empathy by Brené Brown. It's only 3 minutes long, but it really shows what we mean by empathy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So, just really love that video. Just remember, you may find some people need to talk a lot about their trauma. That's part of their process, that others will not want to talk about it. They want to remain very private, and we have to respect that. So one of the key ideas is just follow their lead. Don't feel that you have to make their distress go away. Remember, you're not a crisis counsellor. You can't fix it for them, but you certainly can listen to them. Now, there's a few things that get in the way.
One of the things that I really love about that video is she reminds me, don't start a sentence with "at least." I know I have a habit of trying to make everything more positive in the medical practices, and I have been guilty of this myself. At least the sun's shining, at least it's not yet. So you can go on and on. It's actually not helpful. There's a couple of things that we also have added to this not helpful list. So not helpful to say things like, I know how you feel, you'll be okay. Just don't interrupt. I know that's hard again because you're busy on the front desk, but people need to be heard. And
particularly at the moment.
Yeah. And I think in a medical practice, it doesn't take long to learn pretty quickly. If you don't allow our patients to feel heard, they're going to let the rest of the waiting room know how they feel. And sometimes that makes it harder for everybody. So don't talk about yourself. Don't offer examples from your own life. Don't talk about climate change or the government or what could have been done differently. And don't say things will get better. People need to
just be where they're at, really.
Be where they're at. Absolutely.
So if you were going to practice empathy, it might look something like this. Someone might be talking, you might just say, oh, that just sounds so tough. Or you might say something like, oh boy, you've had such a, really rough time. And I'm going to talk about your confidence around this. It can be a bit tricky. You might just, so you can see I'm just trying, it's very hard when I'm talking to a camera, but I'm just trying to imagine I'm really looking someone in the eye, and I might say something that just sounds so difficult. There's a whole lot of things you can do. We talked about, you can say something like, you must be feeling, I really like this suggestion that Katrina gave, we talked about it earlier. So you might say, oh, you must be feeling really overwhelmed at the moment with all of this going on. You must be so overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I was saying how we, when we're on the front desk, we have a lot of patients, and it's not a counselling role, but we need to listen. So I was saying I couldn't hear myself saying something like, oh, you must be feeling so overwhelmed with everything that's going on at the moment. I'm going to do everything I can to minimize your waiting time today. Sometimes I might say, would you like to go to the treatment room and sit in a quieter place, and I'll come and call you when it's time? Or would you prefer to go outside and wait? I'll make sure I come and get you. So trying to just be aware, using my tone of voice. I can't do much to help. I can't even control the waiting time. But I will try, and I'm letting them know that I care.
And I think you're talking about being flexible. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But just remember this, if you feel uncomfortable with using those sorts of statements, sometimes you don't need to say much at all. Sometimes it's really about this whole notion of sort of being there, just being with that person, giving them your full attention, really listening to them. And that can be uncomfortable because I know you're busy, but, you actually, rather than have them escalate up because they're not feeling heard, sometimes just giving it 5 or 10 minutes in that space will save you, 15 to 20 minutes calming someone down. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I've been using terms in the community sector. Counsellors, we use what we call sentence starters or STEM statements as another way that people describe it. So you might say things like, you might begin your sentence rather than asking a question. You might say, oh, you seem really agitated at the moment, or you might say, you're looking really overwhelmed today. We might say, oh, I can't even imagine what that would be like. It sounds to me like it was just horrible. So you see how I'm saying statements. when I first started this, this was all new to me. I just picked 2 or 3 that felt comfortable, and I started practicing those so that it felt a bit more natural. But over time, I got quite good at being able to say STEM statements. Having said that, some people are not comfortable with this, and I just want to really stress that you don't need to get too hung up on saying the right words. It's a big responsibility when you know someone's struggling emotionally. The best thing you can do is just offer a person that focused, attention. Now, Katrina's going to give specific, tips that can be really helpful. Just something you can take away, a takeaway that you can use.
Yes. As an admin person, I love tips. Here's our top 10 tips. And really, really big one is to shift your expectations. Softening your tone of voice, checking your body language. I often find when I'm working in medical practices that how people come across is not how they intended to come across. So just being aware, and I have to say the first thing I do if a patient happens to be yelling at me, the first thing I do is focus on my body language, my face, my empathy, my listening. So it's hard to do at times. Soften your facial expressions.
That can be tricky,
yes,
but really worthwhile practicing that. Just holding yourself, sometimes I have to emotionally I detach myself from it. I am still looking like I'm focused, but because I can be agitated by people as well, but I try my best to not let that agitation show on my face. Now, we're looking at point 5. It talks about putting classical music on softly in the waiting room. So what we know from some of the research, the neuronal research that they've been doing with MRIs, etc., is there's the rhythm of classical music can be really settling. It can actually calm people down. Just having that in the background is really useful. A lot of technical stuff research sitting in the background of this, but we just know that pacing can be really helpful. Be careful, you don't want it blaring out of the the sound system, but just having it playing in the background can be really helpful for calming people down.
Yeah. We talked about giving people an option to sit if they're overwhelmed, and this is something that is not necessarily what we have time for or what we do, but these are, we're talking about contextualizing, we're talking about reacting to the needs of our patients as they appear. So
the 2 things here is, offering a person, I do this a lot in my work. If someone comes in, I might say, oh, Joyce, you're really agitated today. Would you like me to get you a drink of water? Take a seat. Would you like me to get you, see the tone? Would you like me to get you a drink of water? Or if I've got time, I might say, would you like a cup of tea? Really firstly, we know that just the process of drinking is a connector between that top bottom, that we call that the top of the head and the bottom of the head. That's that connects the two. But also it's a circuit breaker. So, they might be really emotional and, sort of on edge, and if you say, would you like a drink of water, sometimes they can just break that process. And of course, cups of tea, it's just about basic hospitality, and at the moment that might be useful, trying to be flexible as people start to adjust and adapt to what's been happening around them.
And it's kind, caring.
Yes.
What we do have is a lot of information for people.
And they're not thinking properly. They can't look for it themselves at the moment.
Yeah. So we have you have your local primary health networks, and they are all collating the local service information. What you'll see at the end of my presentation is I've collated resource lists from RAC, or the peak bodies, RACGP, APNA, AAPM, etc. There's a whole lot of great help for people at the moment, but that's a whole lot of information, and Monique's explained to us that people will be unable to take all that in. So having that information ready, understand they may not remember what you say. We know at the best of times our patients when they're sick, will struggle to remember more than a couple of things that we say. So write things down for them, especially at this moment, or implement other ways that you can help people remember and track and follow up with information.
And don't be upset if they haven't remembered. It's just that they're probably in a bit of a washout, in a daze. They're flipped out and they're not taking it in. And sometimes you can verbally go through the process with them, but even then that might, depending on what's happened to them and their personalities, how it's responding to the trauma, can really impact on what they're hearing and how their memory's storing that information. One thing that you were talking to me about earlier was what this is like. You mentioned it, earlier.
Yeah.
Talk to that.
It is, well,
Katrina.
as you said, this is more than our usual, and I was more than we've ever possibly known before on the front desk of a practice, and I was really mindful of this. I read blog. A lot of my practices, of course, have been affected, and I read a blog by GP Dr. Beck Hoffman where she was saying 100% of her patients fire affected, 80% cried, and it's very powerful, and we want to do everything we can. Our doctors and our nurses, you on the front desk are also, I know, the support systems for doctors, nurses. You are, when I see 100% of patients are presenting to the doctors and nurses fire affected, I know that's 100% of patients are presenting to you. So you are helping your patients, you're helping your teammates. What is really important is that you help each other and you care for yourself.
And that, I think that's really important. So in the sector that I work in, we do a lot of work around Katrina mentioned it earlier, we would call that vicarious trauma. Some workers are hearing these really terrible stories day in and day out. So it's really vitally important to us that we look after our self-care. And I'll get Katrina to talk through this, but please don't underestimate the impact of hearing people's stories over hours and hours in one day. So it's very important that you're looking after yourselves. So
I would say keep an extra eye on each other. Possibly even have some sort of code between each other if you feel like you are getting overwhelmed. Monique and I are as presenters, we're very big fans of abdominal breathing.
Yes.
If it's a technique that's new to you, I haven't put a link, but please Google it. It is, I wish I'd
really
learned it 20 years earlier. So have a contract with your fellow admin teammate and possibly go for a quick breath of fresh air or walk, remove yourself for a while. Apply those 10 practical tips to yourself and your co-workers.
Just be flexible, be mindful. It's an unusually stressful and scary time.
We hope you know that we are here to support you. Everybody is feeling like they want to help, so reach out for that help. We will continue to provide additional resources. Let us know what you need. Let us know how we can help you. Please know we're thinking of you. We're with you. There are 2 pages of resources here. Be kind to each other, and we will connect with you. Please reach out to us and connect with us too.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your time. I'm very moved by the work that you're doing, and very mindful. And I think you guys are just doing an amazing job.
So thank you, everyone, for what you do, doing what you do. Thank you to Monique for joining us today. Thank you to Practice Coach and the Peak Bodies for support. And we'll hopefully be bringing you more information very soon.